The following is a special presentation.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I stole that from Alfred Hitchcock. And happy Halloween. By the way, any of you know what Halloween means? No? Okay. You're going to get a lesson. It means hallow, holy, eve, evening. It means holy evening. That's what Halloween means. It's sort of odd that we now turn it into trick or treat, but it's a night when things open up between earth and heaven, or maybe they open up between earth and hell. The doors are all open, the stairways are flooded, and that's how people used to think about All Hallows Eve. So happy Halloween. How's your lizard brain today? You know your lizard brain? That's that little bitty thing in the back. It's basically interested in one of two things, fight or flight. Perfect kind of brain for Halloween, isn't it? So it's lizard brain time. I'm going to tell you a little bit about me and this evening. I'm a keeper of ghosts. For, I've forgotten how many years, decades, I've been keeping track of Bethany ghosts. So I'm a ghost keeper. I am not a ghost hunter. I'm a ghost keeper. And I want to ask you a question. Do you know where ghosts live? Nobody knows? No. Well, I'll tell you where they live. They live in stories. That's where ghosts live. They live in stories. Now, I've told you that. I have another question for you. Do you know how to kill a ghost? It's simple. Stop telling the story. So my job as the keeper of ghosts at Bethany is to tell stories. And people will ask me sometime, do you believe in ghosts? And my answer is, I believe in ghost stories. I think the stories are wonderful and important. But I will tell you a little bit about my experience with the paranormal. It started in 1970 when I moved back to Bethany to join the faculty. We got here in early summer, and we'd been in our house for, maybe a month or so, and my wife was in the basement, and she moved an old tarpaulin aside, and I heard screams in the basement, and I go down, and there are mice. She's freaking out. So her solution was simple. We need a cat, like we need a hole in the head, but she found a stray cat and brought it home. And that cat had its kitty litter in the basement, back in a corner. And we noticed after about a month that it would go down there, and sometimes it would head toward its kitty litter, and it would get 3 or 4 feet from the kitty litter, and suddenly it would just leap in the air and zoom backward. Crazy cat. Or so we thought. And it was sort of amusing to see the stupid cat go down, and boom, off it went. It would arch its back, tail in the air, off it went. And we told some friends about it that owned the house before we rented it. And we were laughing about the cat, and they said, it's not funny. And we said, why? They said, now, you said down in that corner, back on the west edge? Yeah, that's where our dog died. That's where our dog died. We moved the kitty litter and had a much happier and less neurotic cat. The other encounter that I had with something I don't understand happened the summer that my wife and I were married. At that time, I was at Yale Divinity School, and I had agreed to be an interim minister for a person on vacation in the DC area. And one of the ways they handled my salary that summer to save themselves money is they moved us from house to house as we went through the summer. Somebody go on vacation, we'd house sit for them. First time we were newly married. We'd been married just a few weeks. The first house was a third floor apartment with no air conditioning in Washington, D.C. in July. Not good. And we were looking forward to the end of the summer when we got a whole month in one place, a new home, air conditioned, an upper level State Department person lived there, and so we moved in there, air conditioning. And so we got there, everything was fine except, like I said, we're newlyweds. And the bedroom was a nice bedroom, except they collected things that they liked from all over the world, including some beautiful African masks. And I love West Coast African masks. But they'd taken one of them, put it on the wall next to a lamp beside the bed. You turn the reading lamp on, and the eyes and nose lit up. This was not good for a newlywed's bedroom. So, after putting up for a while and deciding it's too freaky, we took it off the wall and put it in a drawer. And I went off to a church meeting the night after we did that. And I came back and I opened the door and bang, I hit the chain. It's locked up tight. My wife comes to the door with a knife in her hand. And I'm thinking, it's only been 2 months. I haven't been that bad yet. Locked out, knife in hand. I don't know what's going on here. And she says, somebody's in the house, somebody's in the house, somebody's in the house. This is disturbing. So she does undo the chain, and I come in. And I'm trying to be brave. You're a new husband. You got to be macho. You got to stand up and be strong. So I said, well, where is this person? Up in the attic. Up in the attic. I heard them walking around. So I take the knife and I go to the attic door. And this is really hard. I opened it. And I got the knife in front of me. And I flip the light switch on and I start slowly up the steps. At one point my head's going to come above the floor in the attic and I'm going to be standing up there with I don't know what. And I get up there, it's empty. The whole attic is empty. There's nothing up there, just an empty room. So I come back, and this is 1966, and I go, okay, dear, what you been doing while I've been gone? Sniff the air a little bit. And tease her, and she said, no, somebody was really there. I'm not kidding you. So the next night I'm home, and suddenly I hear footsteps up in the attic. And this time I'm a little less scared. I check it out, nothing there. My parents come for a visit. My dad got into terrible trouble because my mom heard footsteps up there and started shouting at him, and he wouldn't answer. And, he comes walking in. Why wouldn't you answer me when I called? I was out in the yard. Yeah, I heard you upstairs. So that went on for a while, and it was disturbing, but it wasn't hurting us too much. And we finally decided to check on something. We took that mask out of the drawer, put it back on the wall. The footsteps went away. So those are my own encounters with stuff I don't understand. Enough of that. Let's go to Bethany. And to Bethany's ghosts. I'm going to start way out on Point Breeze, out past the field house. There's a big mansion out there. It used to be a fraternity house. It was my fraternity house. I lived there for 4 years. And originally, that house was one of the most important mansions in the Upper Ohio Valley. A man named Colonel Nave built it in 1899. It had running water. It had electricity in 1899. One of the reasons that Alpha Sigs had to leave it is because it still had 1899 wiring, and the fire inspector didn't really approve of that. He told us what we had to do, and we saw it was going to cost $1 million to put it back together. That was the end of that. But when the Alpha Sigs moved into that house, it had been a number of things after Colonel Nave died. They took the third floor and reworked it. The third floor had been a ballroom with a skylight in it. And people came out in their carriages, and they would stay like Gone with the Wind. They'd stay 2 or 3 days and have a good long party. And it was an elegant place. Well, when the Alpha Sigs moved in, we needed more rooms. So what had been that big ballroom was suddenly 7 rooms. And what we've concluded is that Colonel Nave didn't like that very much. Colonel Nave, and as I talk about ghosts, I don't like to talk about ghosts if there's no really reason to think that there's a disturbed spirit somewhere. And in the case of Colonel Nave, what I've learned about him is that he was a wonderful guy, and he did like his bourbon. He liked his bourbon in the afternoon. He liked his bourbon in the evening. He liked a little bourbon when he got up in the morning to get the motor running. And so one morning he got up and he got the motor running, and he had a new horse, a young horse, a little bit on the rambunctious side, and he goes out to mount the horse to go inspect his properties. And the horse threw him and he broke his neck. And so probably a disturbed spirit there. He hadn't quite planned it that way. So anyway, Colonel Nave, when we divided those rooms, has an aversion to the rooms. And he's not a nasty ghost, not mean. This is not a ghost story about a ghost that scares the bejesus out of people. It's a different kind of ghost. And over the years, there are a lot of parallel stories, and I'll just share 2 of them because a lot of them are alike, which makes you think that they may be either people just telling the same story or this happens a lot. And what will happen, the first I'm going to tell you is a young man that was a bio major. He was staying here over the summer working on his senior project. And there are only 2 other guys in the house, and they were all up on 3rd floor. And he would come back after a day at the lab, and his room would be trashed. Books thrown all over the place, clothes on the floor, and he was a neat and tidy kind of guy. And he would get on the other 2 guys, well, you know, leave me alone. I'm not bothering you. So he finally got tired of it. He went into Robert Scott Lumber Company in Wellsburg, and he got a chain lock for the inside of his door, and he got a 2x4. And he came back and he thought, I'm going to go in my room and I'm going to lock this thing up and nobody's going to bother me tonight. Nobody's going to be... So he changed the door. He puts the 2x4 under the doorknob and he goes to bed and goes to sleep. And in the wee hours of the morning, he wakes up because suddenly he's very warm. Really, really warm. And he gets into that zone where he's finally awake enough to sort of feel, you know, I'm not only warm, I'm wet. And I'm wet where I don't want to be wet. And he wakes up enough to see that his hand is in a bucket of warm water. And he's wet the bed. And he gets up ready to go kill somebody. And he runs toward the door. The 2x4 is still under the doorknob. And the chain's still on the lock. Another kind of parallel story. A guy, again, same kind of problem, thinks the guys are on his case, does the same sort of thing, puts a chain on the door and makes sure he's not going to get bothered, goes to sleep, and he's uncomfortable in his sleep, tries to turn over, he's just not turning well, and wakes up a little better and starts to really turn, and he can't move. One hand's up here, the other hand's up there. He's handcuffed to his bed. Little kid handcuffs. He gets up furious again. Chains on the door. And there are other variations on that. So Colonel Nave seems to have been extremely frustrated by all those doors and all of those petitions, and he haunts the house, may still, I don't know, haven't been out there for a good while. Now, when you were an Alpha Sig in the days when I was here, believe it or not, in the days of my undergraduate years when dinosaurs and mastodons wandered around Bethany, students weren't allowed to have cars. Can you imagine? no cars. So Alpha 6 walked in. We walked in. There was a pond behind what is now the stadium. The pond was there for many years, and a great flood washed it out a few years back. But there was a lovely stone walkway at one edge of the pond, and people would walk through there and then around and into campus. And there was a midnight ghost there. Guys would be coming back at midnight from whatever they'd been doing, and they'd be back along, walk along that pond, and suddenly, if they were there and they heard the tower clock striking, as it was beginning its gongs, their head would turn toward the water. They didn't want to turn, their head just turned. And they would see a fluorescent green begin to sort of bubble in the water. Then, suddenly, the most beautiful naked woman would just come straight up out of the water and walk toward them. Well, being guys, they would walk toward the young woman, only to find splash. There's nothing there, and they're dripping with moss and water, and they come into the house and try to explain themselves. What we know is that Colonel Nave had a daughter who loved that pond. It had swans and geese and things like that back in the day when that was a plantation and a mansion. And she killed herself. And we rather think that she wasn't old enough to have enjoyed all of life, and so periodically she would rise up out of the water and, come on, guy, splash. Well, back on into town, you've all walked across the bridge to the field house, haven't you? Well, this is a bridge ghost. It's another midnight ghost. And this ghost is present somewhat like the ghost of Jessica, that is to say, stroke of midnight, if somebody's crossing the bridge, same kind of thing will happen, that is to say, something will turn their head, only this time it turns it upward to the sky. And they're staring up there. And again, something starts to form and pulse in the sky. And then suddenly what emerges is very clearly a very pregnant Native American woman. And as she appears in full form up in the sky, suddenly she begins to scream. A real terrifying screech goes out, just keeps going and going, and then her belly splits open and a baby tumbles out into the sky. And the shriek just keeps continuing, and the baby continues to fall, and then suddenly it all just begins to disappear. Now at the bottom of that hill, under the bridge, you just turn and start up to Bethany. You ever look back, there's a little fishing camp back there? That's called Logan's Run. And it's named after Chief Logan, the very famous Delaware Indian warrior who was known as the Peace Chief, trying to bring peace to settlers and Native Americans here in the valley in the late 18th century. And he worked hard at that. And one day, he and a group of warriors were out on a hunting fishing trip. Their main village was near Steubenville. And they'd come down the river, and I like to imagine they came up the Buffalo. I don't know that. But they were away. That's a beautiful fishing camp right there. If any of you fish, right back at the end of that fishing camp, throw in a line. It's good smallmouth bass. So anyway, they'd been out and they come back to their village, and it's been burned to the ground. And everybody in it, and mostly the only thing in it was women, children, and old people. Everybody slaughtered. And Logan's own daughter was not only slaughtered, she was pregnant. And her belly had been slit open, and the baby had been impaled on a bayonet. This is a true story. I'm not making any of this up. A man by the name of Greathouse led a group of angry settlers on that slaughter. It has a horrible ending, too, because Logan ceased being a peace Indian and went on the warpath, and he finally found Greathouse and Greathouse's men on an island down in the Ohio toward Marietta. And when he caught them, he had them He slit their bellies just a little, pulled intestine out, and then he took grapevine and attached it. And put the grapevine around a tree and marched them around a tree until their intestines came out. This is a horrible story, isn't it? I think that's the ghost of Chief Logan's daughter that hangs there in the sky, a reminder of how nasty and cruel sometimes humans can be. Well, coming into town, I'm going to do one Old Main ghost. There are more than one, but I'll do one, my favorite one, the Tower Ghost. And this ghost is I don't know whether this ghost is present anymore, because the way it manifests itself is sort of not in keeping with the way we live at Bethany now. But back in the mid-1980s, Bethany completely redid Old Main. I mean, top to bottom, including a new slate roof. And when they were doing that, there was scaffolding that would let you get up onto the roof itself. And that year we had a student at Bethany, a wonderful diver, set all kinds of records. And he was from Japan. It was one of the first times we'd had Japanese students. Very successful in the pool, very unsuccessful in the classroom. His English was just not ready to come over. And so at the end of his semester, he was extremely disappointed and frustrated and worried about what he would say to his family in a culture that has a culture of excellence. You can't flunk out. And so he climbed up onto the roof and jumped off of Old Main and killed himself. And after that, you had stories from people, at that time, students lived in Moreland Hall. It was a dorm. And you'd have students that were in the rooms that faced Old Main Tower. And this is another midnight ghost. Students in one of those rooms would be sitting there at midnight and reading, studying, whatever they were doing. Again, their eyes would be pulled up whether they wanted or not and focused on the tower as the clock started to strike. And they would watch the glow in the tower get brighter and brighter and brighter, and then they would see a figure walk out onto the balcony at the tower. And that figure then would stand up and balance on the railing and then do a swan dive, a perfect swan dive off the tower, and just suddenly come toward their window and become larger and larger and larger as they came toward the window. And the person couldn't break eye contact. It just kept coming and coming, and then suddenly the glass would just shatter in their window. And that would be the end of the experience. Can you imagine telling your RA, a ghost just knocked my window out? I'm not responsible. I didn't do anything. But that happened to folks, and now there's nobody over there at night, at midnight. I don't know whether it's still around or not. Could be. I'm going to start down the hill now from Bethany and head down toward the post office. On the corner, just before you get to the post office, is Miss Mahaffey's house. Have you noticed the plaque there that says Miss Mahaffey's house? She was a wonderful, wonderful teacher at Bethany, taught here for like 50 years, and was one of the, I think, the only faculty member to ever become a trustee of the college after she retired. A spunky lady. In the late 1960s, when she was on the board, she went to a board meeting, I think it was in '68, and the gentlemen were doing whatever the gentlemen were doing, and then this woman says, "Gentlemen, I think it's time we have beer at Bethany." And you have beer ever since. She thought that having people on the roads was a stupid and ridiculous thing, and that was that. Quite a lady. There's a plaque under one of the trees going down from Kirkpatrick Hall that has a sentence from her. She dares you to love this place the way she did. And so she was a real matron of the college, quite a character. That cat that came to my house was her cat. She had to go to a retirement home, and we inherited the thing. Fleas and all. But it became a good cat. It took a while. But when she left, she had willed everything, including the house, to Bethany College. And she had a lot of specific instructions. These things went here, these things went there. And so people came in and they moved everything out of the house. And it's in the 1970s now. It's after the Vietnam War. And a young Vietnam veteran and his family lived in Miss Mahaffey's house. This guy had been an MP in Vietnam. He became a special investigator for the federal attorney in northern panhandle of West Virginia. He's a no-nonsense kind of guy. And he's working hard late one night, and he hears voices. He hears this voice going, "Who's there? Who's there? Who's there?" And this happened several times as he was up late. He would hear this, "Who's there? Who's there?" And one day he was up at the library and talking to the head librarian and said, "I've got to tell somebody this story, so I'm going to tell you about this." Because he knew that the head librarian, when he was a student at Bethany, had been the caregiver for Miss Mahaffey. And he thought he would appreciate the story. So he tells him the story. And the librarian said, "What did you hear again? Who's there? Who's there?" And the librarian said, "Well, you know, in her later years when she had trouble getting up out of her chair, she just didn't. She would just shout, 'Who's there? Who's there?'" So the two laughed a little bit, went down to the house, then they went down to the basement, they checked things out, and there was a little coal room off at the edge of the basement. And there were magazines there that she had wanted to go to the library, and somehow they'd been left behind. I know this is true because the librarian gave me a very special copy of one of the magazines. The Life magazine that contained Ernest Hemingway's Old Man and the Sea was in that stack. It's worth about $1,500 now. And so they cleared everything out, took things to the library, and nobody's heard a peep out of Miss Mahaffey since. So I guess that was fine with her. We'll go on downtown now. Everybody knows where the Sigma Nu house is? Yep. Yeah, okay, I thought that might be. Sigma Nu ghost. Fairly recent ghost at Bethany, and it has to do with an event that happened there in the 80s. And if you guys think you party, nothing like the 80s. Those people were crazy. I mean, just plain crazy. I won't go into how crazy. Well, I will a little bit, because part of this has to do with an accident that truly happened there. I'll tell you about the accident after I tell you about the ghost. But you need to know something about the Sigma Nu house before I get started. What does it look like to you? Does it look like a fraternity house? Now, what do you think it was before it was a fraternity house? It was a church. It was a Methodist church, and it became the Sigma Nu house. I don't know whether that's a good combination or not, right? So what happens, according to people, is that sometimes they're there and you just hear this huge party happening. Even if there's a party going on, you hear even a huger party going on, and it gets wilder and wilder, and you literally see somebody swinging from a chandelier. There's a big one, it hangs down in that hallway that goes up through. There's a person hanging on the chandelier, and the noise is outrageous, and people are clearly really happy. And about that time, as they see the person swinging from the chandelier, they hear a song. They hear somebody singing, a whole group of people, a choir singing, "Onward, Christian soldiers, marching as to war, with the cross of Jesus going on before." And then they see a cross swing through the air and chop through the cord of that chandelier. And they watch the kid drop and crash to the floor. Don't mess with Methodists. Okay. A kid really did fall from the chandelier at the Sigma Nu house in the 80s. Terrible broken back, lots of serious consequences from that. That ghost apparently every now and pops up and you hear that. Just shut a party down. Put a damper on it. Well, I'll swing on over to the Beta House. And across from the Beta House, there's a cemetery, right? You ever go back through the trees? I know it well. I was caregiver for it this summer. You ever weed whack a cemetery? That's hard work, especially since the grass goes right back and you have to do it again and again. And next to that is what they call the Old Meeting House. Originally Bethany Memorial Church before we built the one up on Main Street. And this is a story about a ghost at the Old Meeting House and Cemetery. And it's betas who tell the story because they'll be out and suddenly, well, what they do is they're out there and they suddenly hear this. They hear a song, sort of like singing a song. Well, this is a different song. They hear a beautiful tenor voice going, "The bell in the tower is ringing, and Bethany's children respond to her call. They march down the corridor singing, of Bethany we love thee, the fairest of all." We used to know songs at Bethany. We used to actually sing them. It's what we did at dinner. Isn't that crazy? We all ate dinner at the same time. We sat down at tables and were served. But that was another time. Men and women ate in separate places. Men ate in what is now Renner Union. Women ate in what is now Renner 2. Men had to have coats and ties on or they couldn't eat. Women had to have skirts and blouses, dresses, or they could not eat. But those were old times. Dragons, dinosaurs, those days. By the way, there's a story about Jane Fonda. The same kind of rule existed at her women's school. They had to wear heels and gloves. Well, apparently that was the way it was written, heels and gloves. So she shows up at dinner wearing heels and gloves and nothing else. Anyway, back to the Old Meeting House. I tell the story about that singing ghost. They'll just hear the song popping up in the middle of the night. Nobody's there. But we know what that's about now. I was told the story that it was about a kid that died and they couldn't bury him because it was such a cold, frozen winter, so they slid him under the church, and that the kid had that beautiful tenor voice and blah, blah, blah. And that was not too far off of what really happened. Dr. Dwayne Cummins helped write a 3-volume history of Alexander Campbell. And as he was doing the 3rd volume, he came across a letter that explained this whole thing. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, his nephew came to Bethany. Davis himself brought him up here. And so Campbell took a kind of special interest in the kid. And the Campbells were hosting a skating party on the Buffalo. That's how solid everything had frozen. And this kid was out there showing off, skating around, and he hit a piece of wood that had frozen up into the water and flipped him, and he landed on his head. And they pulled him aside, wrapped him in blankets. They thought he was okay. He went back to his dorm, and in the middle of the night he went into convulsions, and he died. And it was true that the ground was so frozen they couldn't bury him. And there was so much snow that winter, nobody could come from Alabama up to get him. So they slid him under the church. And when things thawed out enough that they could dig a grave, they did. And they dug a grave in the old cemetery and they buried him. And then in the late spring, early summer, the family could come up again. They came up and they unburied him and sent the body back to his family. Well, Bethany students refused to let them fill in the grave. Instead, they took flowers down and they kept that grave open for several years in honor of the young man. And so I think we should expect to hear him singing there from time to time. His name was William Stamps, and he came to Bethany in the fall of 1942, and he died on February 10th, 1843. Sometimes these ghosts turn out to, you got a story, and there turns out to be some real fact behind them. The next one, I'm going to go on out to Campbell Mansion. Have you guys been to the mansion? It's worth a trip. It's an interesting place. And our founder's a very intriguing man. Very, very important politician in the 19th century. Literally, presidents came to visit him. He was invited to preach. There was a mistake by the news media when they said that the Pope was the first religious figure to ever to speak to a joint house of Congress. It wasn't. It was Alexander Campbell. That's how important he was as a preacher, as a politician, as an educator. Big deal in his time. His house is interesting. So is he. He died in that house. He died in the bed that's there. And his second wife, his first wife, died from tuberculosis. His second wife was with him when he died. And so in her diary, she writes an account of his death. And she says she's sitting with him, and she can tell that he's just fading away. And she says to him, "Our Savior will walk with you in the valley of the shadow." And Campbell says, "Yes, he will. Yes, he will." Those were his last words. Guess what people hear in that room sometimes? Yes, he will. Yes, he will. Yes, he will. In that same room, this is the Campbell master bedroom, there's a little cradle, wooden cradle. Campbell had 14 kids. He traveled constantly all over the United States and to Europe. But we know what he did when he was home. 14 kids. 14 kids. By the way, he wrote some letters to he was the Brooke County delegate to the Virginia Constitutional Convention in 1829, 1830. And he wrote letters back to his second wife. They'd only been married about a year. They're scorchers. We would charge him with sexting today. There's something. They're cool. So whatever you hear about him, he wasn't a stodgy old guy. But that cradle there was made by his father-in-law. And we think probably all 14 kids were in the cradle. And caretakers out there sometimes hear a child just screaming and crying. You know how 2-year-old, 1-year-old can go at it? And they hear that screaming and little kid in there, and they go to see what's up, and they get there, and they see the cradle rocking. And it's just rocking, and the sound will go away. Kid goes to sleep, cradle rocks, then it just stops. So make sure you get out to the mansion. Maybe you'll hear. Yes, he will. Yes, he will. Or maybe you'll see the cradle go. I got to go up to the cemetery. You've been up to the Campbell Cemetery? Oh, that's a good place to go. Go some night, Go when the stars are out. Full moon. And this is a story about 3 guys that lived in Campbell that decided to go up and see if there really were ghosts up there. So they go up to the mansion. The mansion has a huge stone wall around it. There are no doors or gates in the wall. If you're a pallbearer at that cemetery, and it's still a real used cemetery, you literally have to lift the coffin up onto the top of the wall and then haul it down over on the other side. So they go up and they climb over the wall. There's a stone step that takes you up and over and down. And there's a big mausoleum there with a green copper door with bullet holes in it. This is real. You can go up and check me out. It's Argyle Campbell's tomb, and it says, "Beyond this door is rest." That's what it says on that big green door. So these guys go up to the cemetery to see if it's truly haunted. And they get there a little before midnight. And so they crack open some beer. And they wait. And they hear the tower clock. Nothing happened. So they crack another beer. They tell each other some scary stories. And they wait into the night. Nothing happened. So they crack another beer. And later in the night, maybe it's even early in the morning, I guess, they got tired of waiting. And so they gather up their blankets and their backpack and they get ready to return to the dorm. And one of them, let's just call him George. George had fallen asleep. Okay. And his good buddies look at him all curled up and breathing easily beside the mausoleum. And one of them signals to the other. And so they tiptoe out, climb over the wall, and they leave George there in the cemetery to fend for himself. Well, George wakes up the next morning and he is cold, and he is wet, and he is angry. And he shivers as he folds up his blanket and stuffs his backpack. His hands felt numb, his legs are stiff, and he curses at his friends all the way back to the campus. Well, he gets back to his suite, and his so-called friends greet him with laughter, and they tease him for the rest of the day. George was angry with them, and he was disappointed about the night at the cemetery. Nothing, absolutely nothing happened. No scary sounds, nothing spooky in the dark, no rattling bones, no clanking chains. Nothing. He'd slept the whole night in the cemetery, and all he got for his trouble was cold, wet sleep. He stood with his hands still in gloves, stuffed in the front of his hoodie, feeling like a real idiot as his friends just laughed and laughed. Exhausted, angry, George collapsed on the sofa and fell asleep. He woke with a scream. His arms were flailing in the air. His body was trembling. His nightmare had seemed terribly, terribly real. He was inside the large mausoleum, pounding with all of his strength against the green door. It echoed like a great timpani with each pound of his fist. He screamed and he screamed, and there was no response. He scraped at the door with his fingers and he screamed again. Somewhere in the middle of this horror, he woke up. His suite mates had rushed in when they heard the screams, wondering what was happening. As he began to tell them, he took off his gloves and he looked at his hands. The edges of his fists were bruised. His fingernails were torn and bleeding. George grew hysterical as he looked at his hands. Then suddenly, as if to rid himself of this whole terrible night, he pulled his hoodie up over his head and he threw it on the floor. When it hit the floor, something bounced out from the hood. George reached down to the floor and he held it up. He held up the top two joints of an ossified human finger. Phillips Hall. Anybody live in Phillips Hall? Yeah, Phillips Hall. I've told stories about Phillips Hall ghost a lot, and I tell them, as I said, I just collect stories and I tell them. And I was telling these stories to a group of alums a few years back, about 4 years ago, something like that. And an 80-year-old came up to me afterward and said, "Well, you got that wrong." And I said, "What?" I had told a story. The story went like this, that there's a ghost that haunts second floor, different rooms. It moves around. It's a poltergeist. It likes to do things like throw clothes off of hangers. It's a little bit like the ghost out at the office Sig House. Knock books off of shelves. Just generally be a nuisance. It also has the capacity to take a room that's all steamy hot and turn it 32 degrees in a second, or the vice versa. And I said that I'd been told that this ghost was there because in the 1940s we had a special program at Bethany that worked with the U.S. Navy to train young Navy officers. And I'd told that one of them had fallen in love with a girl at the dorm, and he was getting ready to ship out, and he found an old ladder, and he climbed up to the window for the last night, and on his way up the window, the ladder collapsed, and he fell and died. That was a story I told, a story I'd been told. And this guy said, no, you're wrong. He said, I can show you the name of the guy that died. And he took me down to the center of Old Main, and you'll see a wooden stand there that has the names of all Bethany graduates who died during World War II. And we went down the list till we got to M, Frank McEvoy. It reads Frank McEvoy, McKeesport, Pennsylvania, Navy V-12 program, date of death, October 13, 1943, Bethany, West Virginia. He died in a chemistry accident. He didn't die falling off of a ladder. But it's probably the ghost. Phillips Hall Lounge, isn't it beautiful? In the day, back in my day anyway, again, mastodons and dinosaurs and all of that, there was something called Phillips Hall Formal. In those days, that was of freshman women's dorm. In those days, freshman women were locked up like maidens in a tower. Literally, they had to sign in and out at a front desk, and a housekeeper, a house mother they called them, sat there and signed you in and out. If you were going to the library, you signed out, 11:53, I'm signing out. And then when you came back from the library, you signed in at 1:51. And that's the way it went. And there were curfews. Women had during the week had to be back in the dorm by 10 o'clock. The theory, there was nothing for men. The theory was you lock up the women and the guys go home. That's some truth to it, I guess. But in those days, life here was much more formal. I told you about coat and tie for dinner. Well, the Phillips Hall Formal was truly a formal. Tuxedos for men. And you only got to go if a freshman woman invited you. So it was a big deal, affair. And this is a story I heard from the 50s. A freshman girl from New Jersey. We had a lot of kids from New Jersey, New York in those days, a whole lot, including one wonderful one who became my wife. And this is a story about a young girl from New York who fell head over heels for a real BMOC. The guy was handsome, he was a diver on the swim team, pre-med, his dad was rich, a DC surgeon, and she asked him to the formal, and he said yes. Well, she jumps up and down and bounces all over the place, and went home for a shopping trip to New York City to buy the right gown. And she and her mom went to Bloomingdale's and Bergdorf Goodman and Lord & Taylor and I don't know where all. And she ended up with a beautiful yellow satin dress with a white lace brocade. And he sent her a corsage, and he shows up in his tuxedo, a white scarf, a black cashmere coat, crisp winter evening. She was the belle of the ball. They waltzed away the night, and she floated up the stairs to her room. Fairy tale romance follows. And she's waiting to meet his parents over Christmas. And suddenly, a hemorrhage in the middle of the night. And her roommate found her in blood-clotted sheets, dead. Sometimes in the late hours, 2 or 3 a.m., the piano in Phillips Hall begins to play a Strauss waltz. And then in the middle of the lounge, a luminescent yellow satin gown with a white brocade twirls to the music around and around and around the lounge. Listen. Sarah. Anybody ever hear about Sarah? Yeah, Sarah. I'm going to start by reading an email. This was sent to me by Melissa Schreiner-Himes, a Bethany graduate. She says, we're going to get to a seance for those of you who don't know. She says, the seance was in my room. I remember some of the people in attendance, and there was a white witch who was in from New York. Many people who lived in that room had problems with the door getting locked, losing things, mysterious items turning up, and lots of boys would have shortness of breath and dizziness. So I went back to Bethany for homecoming after 30 years, and I walked into Phillips, and there were 3 young women sitting in the lobby. Strangest thing, without my saying a word, one of them started talking about her favorite hoodie, 2 pair of running shorts, and her iPod going missing, and having to call security because the door was locked when she returned from a friend's room. You guessed it, she lived in the same room. So I told them the story. She said that they have a friend, Alex, who can't even come in the room without getting sick. And she says Larry Grimes still does his ghost stories for Halloween, but he talks about Sarah who hung herself in the attic. I clearly recall that the spirit who was conjured up on that November day in 1976 was burned in a chemistry lab and died maybe in the 1960s. We got a name that day, and I thought it was Mary. Well, what we do know, by the way, there are 2 ghosts involved here, or at least 2 experiences of this. Melissa's talking about something that happened in November of 1976. The story I've been telling about Sarah happened in 1991. So they're 2 different appearances, 2 different seances, maybe the same ghost. And what we think is, given that she thinks that in her seance experience, the person died in a chemistry experience, the name isn't Mary, as she thought. And the name may not be Sarah, as I was told from the second seance. The name of the actual person was Nancy Ashcroft, and I know about that because she died in a chemistry lab accident while I was a student here in 1963. And she says the guys who were doing the paranormal experience checked out old housing records and found out that the victim had lived in our room, Nancy Ashcroft. I think it was their senior project for psych, and I often wondered if we weren't the experiment to see how scared we might be. I would like to know. Well, the Ouija board that I'm talking about that spelled out Sarah, that story came to me through Dr. Frank Gorman, who was professor of religious studies at the time. In the middle of a morning, like 1 or 2 in the morning, he gets this phone call from clearly a disturbed student going, calm down, 1 word at a time so I can hear you. And the girl says, you got to come up to Phillips, we need an exorcism. And he listens a little bit, he's all groggy, it's 1 in the morning or something, and he says, you got the wrong person. You need to call the priest. I don't do exorcisms. So the girl did. They called Father Pat, and he went up and talked with them. I don't think he did an exorcism, but he calmed them down. And from that came the story of Sarah. This is 3rd floor Phillips. In one of those corner rooms, which at the time was a triple. And 3 young women lived there, Sarah, Emily, and Mary, and we got the names from the Ouija board. They may not be accurate. They were roommates. They're first-year students. It's Phillips. They're best friends, and it's, you know how it is your freshman year. You have roommates. You see one, you see them all. They just cluster together. They go one place. There they are. That's the way freshmen move. They were really attached. They were Siamese triplets. And Sarah really loved Mary and Emily. She liked to hug them. She liked to give them back rubs. She liked to watch them undress. She liked to fall asleep resting her head in one of their laps. She really loved them. Then came October. Heaven and hell party. Dates. First Mary, then Emily would sleep over with her guy or invite her guy over when a roommate was away. They would tell Sarah their love stories, and they hugged her less and less. They didn't rub her back or her neck anymore. Sarah became depressed, a loner. She wore black. She didn't shower or wash her hair. She wandered the campus at night. And one night when Mary was away for the weekend and Emily's current boyfriend was off campus with his sports team, Mary asked Sarah if she could have an evening together like they'd had in the old times. Well, Sarah gushed out a great big yes, yes, yes. And that day, Sarah got out candles and incense. She put a lace spread over her bed. She cut a CD of Just So music. Then Mary called and said she'd need to cancel. Her boyfriend was sick and couldn't make the travel squad, so she needed to play nurse for the night. Sarah's face tightened into a scream, and she threw a book against the wall. She turned the music up to full volume. She left the candle burning. Wax dripped onto paper. Then the wick spilled from the candle and ignited the paper. A tip of flame caught the curtain hanging low from the window. Smoke filled the room and drifted under the door. Sarah's RA pounded on the door, then took the master key and turned the lock. Flames leaped at her and she grabbed the hall fire extinguisher. Once the flames were doused, she felt sudden coldness fill the room. Stuff was strewn everywhere. She saw a razor blade on the desk. There were blood drops on the white lace bedspread. Drops of blood on the floor. She hadn't noticed in the rush of the fire, but spatters of blood led from the room down the hall toward the attic. She followed the spatters. They ended at the closed door. Hesitantly, she opened the door, then screamed. Sarah's lifeless body hung from the rafters. Clotted blood had pooled on the floor beneath her slashed wrists. A chair lay on its side a couple of feet away. Even today, sometimes students hear a crash in the attic, like the sound of a chair kicked over. Some say they even see blood ooze from under the attic door. But we're going to end in Phillips Hall with this one. It's late at night. I don't know which room. It's a single. And a young freshman girl comes back to her room tired and partied out. She senses someone in the room, and she looks around a bit using light from the hall, doesn't find anyone, closes the door, and chains it shut. She keeps 2 goldfish, and she blows a goodnight kiss to her fish. She tumbles dizzily into bed. Instantly, she's out. And she wakes as light fills the room, her head's throbbing, her eyes open slowly. She sees water in the fish tank, and it's turned pinkish. She struggles from her covers, and she stands wobbly before the fish tank. The fish are floating on the surface, gutted. Her biolab scalpel with a blood-stained mark on the blade is beside the tank. She turns to the door. The chain dangles free. There's a mirror on the back of the door. And there's a message written in blood. It said, "Decided you could keep breathing. You are so pretty when you sleep. Good night."